For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates. This is StratNewsGlobal. I'm Amitabh Revi, and you're watching our weekday Tuesday to Thursday show at 7 p.m. Indian Standard Time, The Gist. Welcoming back on StratNewsGlobal after a few months, Dr. Avinash Paliwal from London. He's an associate professor of international relations at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. He's also the SOAS South Asia Institute Deputy Director and an author. You might have read his book on Afghanistan. Dr. Paliwal, good to have you back. I don't know, your baby is now 1 year old, so you'll probably be seen a little bit more online.
I hope so. And I'm very happy to be back again.
Our pleasure completely, Dr. Paliwal. Just looking at you've been writing a lot on both eastern and western borders and what's happening there. Just going east and looking at Myanmar or Burma. Latest developments, Aung San Suu Kyi, corruption charges. There's been an air crash of a military plane. I believe a Buddhist monk was on that as well. But in terms of Aung San Suu Kyi, the action that the junta is taking, you've been saying that this is predictable. They'll continue to do what they're doing, right?
Yes. I think the way the situation is evolving, I do not foresee in the short term any radical evolution either from the side of the junta or from the side of the variety of groups and communities and people who are kind of resisting the junta and defending their basic rights, really. In the face of some very intense fighting and a very quickly worsening economic situation in the country across the board.
Right, you're seeing some tweets that are put out by the National Unity Government, and there's a People's Defense Force that has created, and we can talk about these various different groups that you alluded to. But the situation, how do you see it now after the February 1st coup by the military itself, in terms of is the military junta surprised by the number of protests, the intensity of the protests, or the number of groups that are involved? How do you read it since February 1st?
Amitabh, the situation on the ground itself has worsened since the February 1st coup. The initial response in the first couple of weeks we saw was actually highly non-violent. It was very creative in terms of public protests that were coming out. It was, very peaceful. But we saw, instead of accommodating and addressing some of the concerns, legitimate concerns raised by the protesters, many of them young people, there was a recourse to violence by the junta, and that was expected given the nature of the institution that we are looking at. Since then, both the degree of violence, it has decentralized, it has kind of spread across the countryside, and we have seen sparks of urban resistance as well. So as far as the situation on the ground is concerned, in terms of intensity and increment of violence, that is on an upward trajectory, not in a, neither on a stalemate as of now, or showing any signs of abating anytime soon. So the resistance and the counter kind of pushback by the junta, that remains the feature of the situation inside Myanmar. The other thing is, of course, the huge displacement this has caused, which is also leading to different kind of problems, for people inside, but also perhaps in the future we can see much more spilling over into the neighboring countries, including India. In terms of your question of whether the junta has been surprised, I think now the senior general Min Aung Hlaing has gone on to a Chinese state-sponsored television and channel, and often he almost disclosed it that he was surprised by the intensity and the expanse of the protests against the decision that he took on that early morning, or the decision he executed that morning on 1st of February. I think the senior generals and his immediate kind of coterie of commanders, they were not expecting to dislocate or kind of inflame all the fault lines that already existed in the country till then, whether it was the civil-military balance, whether it was the peace process which was going on, however difficult, but still conversations were going on, with the panoply of ethnic armed organizations, many of which had signed the national ceasefire agreement that came into being in 2015. And even there were conversations which were panning out with Bangladesh, however fruitless, on the Rohingya situation, right? So we saw a process which was imperfect, which was stunted, completely becoming inflamed after what happened that day. And I think that is the situation as of now. I don't foresee a resolution, a serious resolution, let's put it like that, on any of these critical fault lines of Myanmar anytime soon.
We just saw that news there from Mizima, which is talking about the number of people that have come across into Mizoram, and there have been reports on that as well, both from our side and some reports from theirs as well. India, how do you see India having reacted from February 1st to now? We've seen the public statements, interactions, whether it's with the U.S. Secretary of State and our Foreign Minister, External Affairs Minister, or otherwise. How do you see India's reaction to developments there?
So, on the very first point that you raised about migrants coming into, conflict-generated migrants coming into Mizoram, but not just Mizoram, Manipur, other states as well. I think this is a story which is still developing, Amitabh. I think you'll see more on this, from even international outlets, not just Indian and Myanmar news outlets. So, and this is something that should worry policymakers in New Delhi, honestly. I don't see that kind of concerns being raised, at least in the public sphere, by the government. I don't see actions which betray that kind of worry as of now. Perhaps they are much more secure in terms of the spillover, the risk of spillover of violence till now. But my assessment is that this is something that is going to become more important for India in a security sense than it has been in these first few months post-coup. Now, India's reaction has evolved slightly, even though it has not been very different from what many people expected it to be. The broader expectation was that India will tread cautiously. It will not go into outrightly condemning or isolating the junta, which it has not, but it has been very careful in not legitimizing the actions at the same time. So the first few statements, whether it was the statements in the early hours after the coup, where the MEA very clearly said that it was deeply concerned, the statement that India made at the United Nations, which was very strong and very clearly articulated India's preference for a politically inclusive democratic process, and to basically to continue the developments that had happened since the creation of the 2008 constitution, to which India at that point in time, India played a very important role in the making and the conversations around that conversation in 2007, 2008, on the back of the so-called Saffron Revolution led by the monks, right? The protests led by Buddhist monks in Myanmar. So I think there is very clearly a preference that Delhi has in going into that direction, but it has kept its options open. It has kept its channels open. I think what we possibly might see in the coming months, or perhaps in the next 6 to 12 month odd period, is somewhat a more diversified strategy, wherein India is not just putting all its eggs in the basket of the junta. Of course, officially it will continue to do the fine balancing on this count, but I think there are various ways in which Indian security planners and Indian policy planners can reach out to a lot of the communities on the border areas in particular, whether it's the Kachin communities, Bama communities, Chins, Rakhine, and try to figure out what can be done in a polity which is completely fractured and riddled with violence, right? Structural violence, really, which has no immediate resolution, to at least secure its own borders, to at least not complicate the security situation in Northeast and the various states, which is a piece which is hard-won, if not perfect still, and to also figure out a way that it does not lose out on the kind of influence that it had developed in Myanmar over the past 20, 30 years. The risk right now is that by focusing on the junta alone, which is very intent on tilting, which is intently tilted in favor of China, that India might actually lose out rather than sustain the kind of importance and the little bit leverage that it had gained inside Myanmar over the past few decades. And I think a bit of diversification of relations would actually keep everyone on their feet within the country and will also signal to the junta that its actions cannot be continued to be justified in perpetuity. So I think that is something which perhaps a direction which India might take if situation in the Northeast kind of worsens as the risks, as the trends are indicating that it might happen. But we haven't seen that yet. It is following the lead of ASEAN, which is not working out in terms of actually resolving the process. It is not taking a lead in terms of actually building that kind of negotiation process, which could lead to some resolution, even if short-term or short-lived. So we need to see how the spillover affects the situation inside Northeast, but also, and that's going to be my last point on this, is the feasibility of the connectivity projects, the Kaladan Road project. In my view, that's not happening.
Yeah.
India has built a port in Saitwe, India, and I've visited the port. It's a functional port, and I think that can be capitalized on. There are two concerns. The road might not actually be built in time or be built ever to be able to be functional, or even if it's built after having some sort of kind of, silent deals with powers that be on the ground in Paliwal and elsewhere, whether it's Arakan Army or anyone else. Who will do business in that environment? You can build a road, but you can't convince a trader to use that road if they don't feel secure. And that is the concern that Indian policymakers should have. If you're planning connectivity projects and planning economic connectivity for the economic development of your northeastern flank, then it's the situation is just not conducive. So you'll have to figure out a way, whether through talks with the junta or other parties on the ground, to be able to manage that situation, both for your internal security and developmental reasons, but also in a strategic sense when you're dealing with China in your immediate east.
A couple of minutes back, that was our four-legged friend Tango who was saying hi. I think he was trying to answer the door. That's what happens when you work from home. I mean, you know that. But on a more serious note, if you're talking about Sitwe and Kaladan, given the situation within Myanmar, does that then also affect China's plans there, whether it's Chokphu and its CMEC?
Absolutely, and I think we've already seen kind of very violent manifestations of protests targeting factories. Chinese interests on the ground, and we have also seen that the Chinese response was more, instead of actually working towards a negotiated settlement of whatever kind, or tempering the behavior of the junta, actually doubling down in its support to the Tatmadaw itself. And I think this is where the political preferences and the techniques that regional countries use in addressing these issues might become, in the future might become very important. I don't think a solution that is one-sided, favoring the junta, would lead to the security and sustainability of the strategic interests and economic interests of any regional power. You are looking at considerable discontent on the ground. You are looking at considerable shrinking of economic resources and capabilities, and even service delivery on the ground. You're basically looking at a situation where these roads and these pipelines will pass. They'll pass through deeply poverty-ridden spaces, and even if they are not centers or kind of epicenters of resistance, political resistance, they can easily become epicenters or locales of crime, organized or unorganized crime. And then a lot of these connectivity projects will become fair game for criminal elements. I mean, people pushed into criminality because of the situation that has been created since the February coup. So I think when we talk about Myanmar, we need to be very conscious that it's not this binary or kind of, these big power centers alone, which we are dealing with, the ethnic armed organizations, the NUG, the junta itself, but we are looking at a lot of people who are left to fend for themselves, are displaced, and the situation is getting increasingly desperate for them to be let without any support. So in that situation, just to finish that point, that situation, no country's interests on the ground would be secure for a prolonged, sustained basis.
I'll just get you to elaborate more on that, but since you're seeing these pictures of old interactions, both with Aung San Suu Kyi, you were talking about left to fend for themselves or no support. You saw Senior General Min Hyun Lang, who's also been coming here, I think, since 2017 and having top-level meetings. In terms of Aung San Suu Kyi, from February 1st itself or soon after that, you've been projecting that her political space has been reduced because of circumstances, not just because of a lack of charisma, to almost minuscule in this whole dynamic? Or is that...
It's not minuscule, absolutely not. But I think the political potency of Aung San Suu Kyi has definitely taken a hit, and it has taken a hit not out of choice, or as you mentioned, out of her lack of charisma, but simply that because she has been completely alienated from her own party and also from communicating to the people at large. And I think that is a very calibrated decision by the junta and those who have kept her under arrest at the moment, right? Now, the reason when I say that the power or the appeal of Aung San Suu Kyi has become limited in that context is simply because the protesters themselves, especially in the early weeks of the coup, post-coup weeks, there was a very important debate that happened in Myanmar on the streets of Yangon, where there was this moment of reckoning that what did we actually believe and support before the coup, that we are now having to deal with the situation, the after effects of it. So when you look at the demands made by the ethnic communities for decades, post-independence, actually, post-1948, there is a reckoning among the Burma majority, especially the youth, that these are not illegitimate demands. These are people who have very much right to be equal citizens in a country where citizenship laws are deeply contested and are very partisan, right? The concerns against the Rohingya, which many people in Yangon and Naypyidaw didn't really bother about when the actual violence was being meted out in the post-2015-2017 context in Rakhine State, and when the huge displacement of Rohingya happened to Bangladesh and other countries. They are realizing that not speaking up then was a folly. So I think and in that context, the idea of Aung San Suu Kyi actually not sticking to those democratic principles and inclusivity is coming to kind of hound her image among people who are protesting against the junta today. And not just among the protesters, even if you look at neighboring countries, I mean, especially Bangladesh, which has borne the brunt of the Rohingya crisis, for them, there's very little difference when you're dealing with Aung San Suu Kyi and Min Aung Hlaing, because in terms of their visions, in terms of their policy approach towards these issues, they've been actually very similar. The contest was, the insecurity between them, or the competition between them, was really to capture a space which was already very politically loaded and politically partisan and explosive. It was not different viewpoints that were contesting for supremacy. It was similar visions, but two different individuals with different institutional make, one civilian electoral democratic, and others military leader. So I think that is what limits her appeal. Even, let's say, if she comes back, if she's released and she's allowed to continue her political life the way she used to do before 1st of February, I think she will not be able to sustain her political rhetoric or the political kind of thrust that she had adopted, both on the peace process as well as on the Rohingya issue, as well as on a variety of other issues in terms of the civil-military balance of the country anymore. So if Aung San Suu Kyi comes out and becomes politically active ever, I think we'll very critically see, very importantly, we'll see, or we hope to see, a different political face and a political idea being propounded, because the base has shifted. She was responding to the demands of the political base that she thought she represented then, but the base and the mood in that political base across communities has shifted decisively in context of the February coup on these issues. So I think that is why, when I say that her appeal as the leader, as she was till then, has limited, that's what I mean. If she rebrands herself, if she is allowed to rebrand herself and come back into politics, things can, of course, change.
In terms of international players, we've seen Russian visits there, and they have been moving up their military supplies as well. But in terms of China, or if you want to talk about Russia as well, most welcome. In terms of how Senior General Min Aung Hlaing has been wary of China, but is he being pushed into that corner because the rest of the world is against the junta?
Yes and no. So this is a very fine political dance, to be very honest with you. Now, there are multiple sources of mistrust that we have seen among the junta and its leadership when it comes to the China question. In a very immediate sense, or let's say in the last kind of 5 to 10 years, the kind of mistrust that we see for the junta, for China among the Tatmadaw leadership was reflective of, a larger kind of historical sensibility that the Chinese have a tendency to interfere in our conflicts, and that they are interfering even in the current conflict by supporting different ethnic armed organizations. And even at a mass public level, there has always been a bit of a wariness or a mistrust of Chinese, for the pervasive Chinese influence in Myanmar's social life across the board, not just in the kind of Burma-dominated lowlands, Myanmar's lowlands, but also in the ethnic kind of communities which are spread across the borderlands. There has been this wariness about this very powerful hegemon really pressing its weight, right? It's not very dissimilar to how people in Nepal, perhaps, or Bangladesh or Sri Lanka have felt about Indian influence in these countries, which is a very felt. These countries are, China is a very felt power as far as Myanmar goes, just like India is in the case of some of its immediate neighbors. The other source of mistrust that we have seen that emerged as far as very specifically for Min Aung Hlaing was the fact that the Chinese began to very seriously cultivate and invest in Aung San Suu Kyi since post-2015. They accepted the electoral reforms, the democratic reforms, however imperfect or however partisan or however illiberal they may have been. They accepted them at face value as the mechanism which would lead to the coming to power of whoever comes to power in Naypyidaw, right? And they dealt with those realities accordingly. So they began to invest quite heavily in Aung San Suu Kyi in that 5-year period, right? And they really supported their endeavors. This led to a lot of insecurity among the Tatmadaw's leadership, especially Min Aung Hlaing, who felt that his authority and his outreach and his relationship with the Chinese is being completely dislocated by the civilian leader, very popular leader. So I think the recalibration of power that was initiated by the very violent kind of rebalancing that he initiated, I think was a signal as much to China that at the end of the day, don't go by the reforms that you have seen in the last 10 years. The military still dominates. The military still runs the country, and you'll have to deal with me if you want to deal with Myanmar, and if you want to realize your interests and your motives and your aspirations, whether it be security, strategic, or economic in the form of the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor. It was a move to simply get Aung San Suu Kyi out of the equation. So what we have seen over the next few months post-February 1st is literally Min Aung Hlaing challenging China to about its own approach that it had adopted during the 2015-2020 kind of electoral interregnum that we saw, the experiment that happened, and communicating that this is the reality. It's not, I don't think it's as much this narrative of because everyone does not like the junta, they are being boxed into dealing with the China. I think in the current situation, in 2021, it's a misplaced narrative. Everyone is dealing with the junta, Amitabh. Indians are dealing with the junta.
Yeah.
Almost the entire ASEAN, right? Brunei the ASEAN chair recently went and dealt with the junta. The Russians are deeply engaged with the junta. The Chinese are deeply engaged with the junta. Who is not? Even the Bangladeshis are, with however distastefully for them, dealing with the junta. So that fact that the junta is isolated does not hold any water as of today. That was perhaps true in the 90s phase when there were intense sanctions. Even the sanction regime that we have seen, a very tough sanctions regime imposed by various Western countries, simply does not make much of a dent on the strategic calculus of the generals, because they have various very strong regional alternatives both in the legitimate open political sphere, but also in terms of the illegal trade in which they have the various interests connected to the Golden Triangle and elsewhere. So we are looking at a moment where the junta is very openly being courted by different countries, very openly being engaged by different regional powers, but still prefers China and Russia over others, simply because they see that Beijing and Moscow as the only strategic alternative in the face of a complete, almost blanket ban by the West, so to say. So they might not have all options in the global sense, but in an Asian context, they have a lot of options to play against the West at the UN and elsewhere in various international institutions, including the support that they've received from India, for that matter.
That point itself, we can, if you can just elaborate on that in terms of, earlier you were talking about how you see India's policy possibly developing over the next year in not putting all the eggs in the junta's basket. The security, well, I don't know whether you can call it an umbrella, but the relationship that we had, the submarine, the Kilo class that was given to Myanmar as well, there were other equipment, tanks, I think, and ammunition. General Narwane, the Chief of Army Staff, and Harshingla, the Foreign Secretary, went there, October or November last year as well. So how does India balance itself there in terms of looking after its interests?
See, there are a lot of the defense diplomacy that we have seen between India and Myanmar over the past few decades, which of course manifested in this, supplying of weapons. I think that's a space where, and this all happened before the coup, by the way. This did not happen post-coup. So we are looking at very different contexts. That was India's way of kind of remaining competitive within the kind of the worldview or the interest landscape, if you like, for the junta, but not just the junta. I mean, at that point, the government of Myanmar, the elected government of Myanmar and the military. And that was simply done to kind of offset the kind of influence that it saw that the Russians and the Chinese were gaining or had gained by then. So a lot of that defense diplomacy was aimed towards ensuring some sort of strategic parity with all these regional and extra-regional powers. And I think even allowing the Adani Group to explore ventures, right? That's also kind of signaling that, yes, you have a private entity, but a private entity which is very closely linked to the government of the day, to the ruling dispensation in New Delhi at that point in time. So I think a lot of that happened in that context. The post-coup context has complicated the situations for two reasons. One, a lot of the, some of the deliverables that India expected from Naypyidaw when it was doing this kind of defense diplomacy was to stay away or kind of have some sort of a balance with China. That balance has been completely dislocated in favor of the Chinese, even if India continues to have channels with the junta. That strategic reality that it's the Chinese who are dominant and will continue to remain so in Myanmar for a considerable period of time would not change. So even if India does not support the NUG, even if India does not talk to the ethnic armed organization, it has basically been completely blocked out and sidelined, if not completely shunted out of Naypiydaw's kind of order of priority, if you like, in the neighborhood. So this is the first fact. And this is partly India's to be blamed. When India was talking to the generals before, the common refrain, and this was something which should have been taken more seriously than it was by the generals in Naypyidaw, was that India, it's a no action talk only country. It's a disparaging thing to say for a neighboring power. But they used to say that to senior visiting dignitaries for a long time, that you have promised Kaladan, you have promised arms transfer, you have promised this and that, but you actually don't deliver. So they never really took India seriously in that way. So now when they have to choose, they would of course keep India on side because it's in their interest and it gives them legitimacy. But that would not give India the kind of inroads that it had developed over the past few years. So that's first. Secondly, the counterinsurgency argument, right? That there's a huge thing that in Delhi we make out to be that the junta the Tatmadaw is a very important counterinsurgency partner as far as Northeast goes. But the fact is that it's not. It has blown hot and cold when it did support Indian actions or extradited some of the 22 kind of insurgents. Most of it was done because of junta's own requirements and capacity limitations rather than what India wanted it to do. and it came too late anyways. And most of these figures were really low-level kind of fighters, not any strategically consequential figure within Northeast kind of insurgent landscape. And what we have seen since February is that the junta commanders, field commanders on the borderlands in Sagaing division are actually using India-centric rebels who have operated from the Myanmar side, from all these makeshift camps across the border,
Paying them to.
actually paying them off and in a way strengthening their capacities to basically do the
And using them against the protesters, right?
Exactly. So that is something. Think of the second-order effects of something like that. These people have tactical military value for the junta. That means they will continue to receive support and shelter on the Myanmar side. And that means when they feel much more confident in the coming months and much more empowered for whatever reason, they might actually get more ambitious in terms of expanding their operational base within Myanmar
what objectives
and
in
elsewhere.
Myanmar are, what are interests.
That's a podcast that we had done with the former intelligence officer who was served in Myanmar and was talking about the situation. But then when you write that India should be working towards kind of an inclusive framework in Myanmar, considering all these various pushes and pulls and the dynamism of the situation, what does that mean exactly?
That means that you need to have channels of communication and a strategy of increasing those channels to more overt sphere if required in the future with all different power holders and entities on the ground in Myanmar if you want to secure your interests and if you want to bring, or at least try to bring, some sort of stability to the situation in the medium to long term. Of course, India can't do it alone, but it can kind of ally with countries within the ASEAN, like-minded countries within the ASEAN. It can draw upon the support that it has from the Quad countries, many of whom, United States have now quite openly come and supported, the NUG in some of the tweets that we have seen. Of course, these are tweets, these are words, but they mean coming from such powerful figures in the Biden administration, and the United Kingdom and the European Union is taking an active interest. I think India, when I say India should aim for something politically inclusive, is to use its channel with all these parties, including the junta. Don't give up on the junta, you cannot afford to actually develop some leverage with multiple parties. That way, you can actually temper the behavior. You can actually impress upon a lot of these ethnic armed organizations to kind of reduce the violence, to experiment some sort of a negotiation. But you can also kind of use your relationship with these organizations as a bit of a bargaining chip with the junta itself, and to say that, look, if you don't come towards the talking table and if you don't reduce violence, the basic 5-point consensus, India doesn't need to kind of recreate the wheel. Support ASEAN in its advocacy based on the 5-point consensus in earnest. Work with ASEAN countries instead of unilaterally, right? That is something that can perhaps open a ray of hope in which some sort of stability can be imparted, at least in the short to medium term, one, even if not a complete strategic overall. Two, India will be back in the game. Think of it from your own national interests, right? If you're looking at a potential spillover of migrants and complication of your security and dynamics and increment of crime nexus in your Northeast, this is something that it's very much needed, and it's in your national interest to have that kind of stability on the ground in Myanmar. So it's not just about what's happening in Myanmar. It's also in India's national interest to have that kind of negotiation going in tandem with the desire for stability that the junta keeps talking about. And that is what I mean, that having channels with everyone will allow India to have much more say in the situation and to at least make a bit of a dent in the calculation of the junta, and to make them feel a little bit more under pressure and not let China completely enable one entity which has proven to be a destabilizing force for India's own good. So you need to have that kind of, it's a bit like Afghanistan, Amitabh, that you cannot just have one-sided approach and expect a situation to calm down in your favor. You need to diversify relations, however tactical they might be, however time-bound they might be, however distasteful sometimes they might be. If India can talk to the Afghan Taliban as it is doing now, it certainly can talk to the democracy movement and support and talk to the people of Myanmar, which have a much better and much more legitimate case to make than definitely than the Taliban in Afghanistan.
Dr. Avinash Paliwal, since you're talking about Afghanistan, let's have another half-hour discussion starting now on that subject. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. We leave that for another time. But again, an absolute pleasure having you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. It was an honor to be here, Amitabh. Thank you so much.
Absolute pleasure. Just a reminder to our viewers, do follow our social media handles on StratNews in terms of our Twitter handles or Instagram and Facebook as well. And you can also click on the bell icon on YouTube and subscribe to our YouTube channel. That helps us not just keep going professionally, but you can also support us financially by going onto our website. There's a link in the descriptor. You've been watching the Gist on StratNewsGlobal. I'm Amitabh, Revi.